Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Catalan with black playing c6 in the Open Catalan. This is the position you can see on the board. From now on, I'm going to be publishing the PGNs for my videos, the study PGNs, and they are going to be available on Patreon. So if you're a patron, you can find the PGN for today's video in the feed. And if you want to support me and become a patron, there's a link in the description. So how do we reach this position? Once again, if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Catalan, you can find the link to the entire playlist in the description as well. I would recommend that you do that if you haven't seen it. And there are other moves black can play on move 5. So this is basically the critical position in the Open Catalan, which we reach via several different move orders. One of the most popular is d4, knight f6, c4, e6. White now plays knight f3, we have d5 and g3, the Catalan. Now black has the option to play the closed lines with bishop e7, or he can play the critical move d takes c4, taking the pawn. We are now in the Open Catalan. And after bishop to g2, black now has a ton of options. He can play b5, knight bd7, bishop e7, which we have already covered. Today we are going to have a look at c6, which is a very natural move, but in the following videos we are also going to be covering bishop to d7, bishop b4 check, c5, knight c6, and a6, which is the main line. So c6 in this position, what's the idea? Well, in the Catalan or against the Catalan, black, when he takes the pawn, when he plays the open lines, usually tries to hold on to his pawn, to his extra pawn on c4. Now that may not seem like a big deal now, but considering that the c4 pawn is already far advanced and that it could be supported with b5, then black has the option of creating a very potent pawn majority on the queen side with a pawn chain, for example, with a6, b5, and c4. Therefore, in any endgame, black is going to have a potential passed pawn on the queen side. In exchange for that, what does white get? Well, white plays the Catalan to get enormous pressure on black's position. One of his main assets is the g2 bishop, the Catalan bishop, which is staring at the rook on a8, and there are often tactical issues along this diagonal. Along with that, he has the option to play the move knight e5, firstly trying to regain his pawn, secondly trying to put pressure or further pressure on c6. So if, for example, knight e5 and, I don't know, let's just play a bad move, well, let's say b6, well then there would be tactical issues on the diagonal, you can already see. Let's delete b6. So there are a couple of ways to play against c6. If you know the idea behind the move, then it's going to be easier to figure out what to do. Well, c6 is a very logical move for black. Firstly, it blocks the bishop on the g2 on the h1 AA diagonal, makes it far less powerful. Secondly, it prepares the move b5, which, if black manages to play it safely without any consequences, is going to mean that he indeed does have the extra protected pawn on c4. So what can white do? Well, he can play knight e5 straight away, trying to regain his pawn, or he can play castles. Let's have a look at castles first. In this position, that's a sideline that should nevertheless be mentioned. It's not as aggressive as knight e5, it's not a critical move, but it's still playable, and it's the second most popular move. Now, the only way to punish white for castling instead of playing knight e5, going for the pawn and for the pawn on c6, is to play pawn to b5. Now, there are two options for white. If you play knight e5 now, threatening to take on c6, well then black would simply play bishop to b7, defending everything, and after you play a4, black seems to be in trouble, but after a6, everything is defended. There are no issues on the a file. So, for example, if you take the pawn here, black can safely recapture with the a pawn because the bishop defends the rook. Also, if black captures with the c pawn, that would mean he loses the bishop, therefore the move a6. So knight e5 in this position is not recommended. I think it's still a theoretical move, not that it's bad or anything. After bishop to b7, the theory goes for about 10 more moves. So, for example, a6, knight to c3, knight to d5, and e4 trying to gain pressure in the center after knight c3, bc3 is a theoretical position, and white should be okay, but I think there's a more critical way to play the position. Okay, firstly, this is something you are going to have on the board by transposition if you play the critical move as well after b5. I just think that after b5, if you play what I'm going to recommend, there might be more chances for black to go wrong. So we're going to be looking at a fairly similar position. Look what happens. After castles, you play b5, and instead of playing, black plays b5, and instead of playing knight e5, which we just saw can be responded to with bishop b7, you play a4 straight away. And after a4, there are basically no better moves for black but to play bishop to b7. Now, the reason why I recommend a4 first is if black goes wrong, for example, plays bishop e7, which seems like a fairly natural move, you can simply take. And after pawn takes, then you play knight e5, and then black is lost. So there are more chances for black to go wrong in this position. However, after a4, black should continue with bishop to b7. And now there are two options. You can play knight e5, which we just saw, which is the position we have been looking for a while now. Instead of that, you could go for b3. Now, this is a move I wouldn't recommend. Why? Because after c takes b3, black has now managed to trade off his doubled extra pawn, meaning since the pawn is not on the board, you can never take it. And after queen takes b3, black is now permanently a pawn ahead. He has two options here. He can play a6, again preventing a takes b. He can also play b4, just saving his pawn, which is now protected by the bishop. That means that black now has a protected passed pawn, which is dangerous. Of course, white has much better development in exchange for the pawn. White has the g2 bishop, white's king is safe, and black's king is still on e8, so black could run into trouble quickly, but he has an extra pawn. After knight e5, which is the critical move, queen c8 is the move black should play to prepare the move c5 while defending the bishop. So if you play c5 now, which is a move you would like to play, white would take the bishop. If black takes the pawn on d4, then fine, he wins another pawn, but after bishop to b2, queen to d8, this is just too much pressure. And this is considered to be very good for white, despite white being 2 pawns down. It's not really clear how black is going to develop in any sensible way without, well, getting into huge problems with his king, and white should be better. Therefore, black against knight e5 should play queen c8. And now a5, you want to prevent a5 from black defending his pawn permanently, and c5, which was the idea behind queen c8. And after queen a4 check, knight b to d7, you can take on b7, queen takes b7, you can take on e3, simply putting tremendous pressure on this pawn and on the knight. So for the moment, black is still a pawn ahead, but it seems like he is going to give up this pawn because he will have to play c4 or give up the pawn on c5. And after c4, knight takes c4, relieving some of the pressure of d7, bishop e7, the knight goes back to e5, and in this position, black has enough time to castle. Again, the material is now equal, the material is leveled, but black has this passed pawn, so that could be useful. Therefore, I don't think b3 is the critical move to play. I would recommend going into lines we saw already with knight e5. And after knight e5, black has a couple of options. a6 is the most sensible move. He could also play knight to d5 and queen to c8, preparing c5 and defending the bishop. So remember this position. This is a critical position which you are going to encounter in many Catalans, in many Open Catalans. It doesn't have to be this move order, it could be other move orders, but the patterns are what matters. So, queen c8. Let's look at that first. After queen to c8, white needs to play actively, because if black manages to play a6 and c5, then he will simply be better. So white needs to undermine the structure with b3. And after c takes b3, black is again his extra pawn ahead, and he again plays b4, and we have transposed to the position we saw previously. So that's what you should do if black plays queen c8. You basically have no way to avoid the lines with b3. If after knight e5, black plays knight to d5, now we reach one of the most famous patterns in the Catalan. As soon as knight e5 and knight d5 is played, it's almost always correct for white to expand with e4, chasing this knight back, then following that up with knight c3, defending the pawn. And black now plays a6, and here is the second critical pattern. Once you have this position with pawns on c6, a6, and e6, and black has kept his extra pawn, you have a knight on e5, then it's almost always correct to break with d5. Why? Well, the pawn is, of course, the d5 square is, of course, sufficiently defended from black. He has a bishop, a knight, 2 pawns, and the queen, but you get a ton of compensation in exchange for this break. The main move is c takes, and after e takes, knight takes. Now we see what the Catalan is all about. White plays the move queen to h5. And after g6, which is pretty much forced, remember this knight is pinned to the bishop now that the queen is gone. You play, after g6, you play queen to f3, and black can continue with something like f5 to relieve the pressure on f7. Now, for a pawn, this is huge compensation. Firstly, in regards to king safety, secondly, in regards to development, and I think I would love to have this position with white. Therefore, after knight e5, most people don't go in for knight d5, they play a6. Okay, and after knight c3, which is white's only really sensible developing move, black plays knight d5 now. Why? Because after e4, he does not have to go back, he can take on c3. And after b takes c3, he can continue with knight d7, trying to, well, disturb your position and take on e5. So you have to continue with f4. And after bishop e7, I don't think white has an advantage here, which is coming back to the original branching of the position after c6, which is why I wouldn't recommend castles. I would recommend the main move knight e5. Why? Because here after bishop e7, knight g4 is the main move, and after castles, e5 is the main move. And for example, knight b6, looking at the d5 square and f5, you are going to get a ton of pressure on black's position, but it's basically equal. And after knight e3, black plays g6, you actually have to sacrifice a piece here if you want to stay equal. So knight f5, gf5, and rook f5. And now, if black manages to defend, then he is simply material up. If black doesn't manage to defend, then you win. The engine gives this as 0.00000000000. I wouldn't want to be in white's shoes here, because I have to win by checkmate, basically. If I trade pieces off, I lose. So that's the main line after castling. Now let's have a look at knight e5. So instead of castles, which leads to the position we just saw, knight e5. Okay, this is the most principled move. It aims to regain this pawn straight away, and still keeping a lot of pressure on the position. The downside is the main move that black can play, and that's bishop b4 check. We're going to have a look at that in a second. First, let's look at black's alternatives. In my opinion, one of the most interesting moves is c5. And that prevents knight takes c6. It allows knight takes c4, but if knight takes c4 is played, then queen takes d4 or pawn takes d4. So in this position, white has to play a very uncomfortable move, bishop to e3, simply defending his pawn. And now after knight to d5, which is black's main response, you don't have to fear the knight capturing this bishop. You can simply castle, because if knight e3, then f e3, and all of a sudden black is in huge trouble on f7. So after castles, black plays knight d7, preparing to safeguard his position with knight f6 if need be. And now we continue with knight takes c4, we take the pawn, b5 chasing the knight away, the knight goes back to e5, black now exchanges, and after bishop to b7, he should be okay, fine, his king is still in the center. However, he has the 3-2 pawn majority, and I think this is a very interesting line. So white's main is knight c3 and knight takes bishop, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, f takes knight, bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, and b4, for example, chasing the knight away, knight b5, rook d2. I don't see any issues for black here. In fact, I would rather be black. 3-2 pawn majority, very active rook, and material is equal, but black has tripled pawns, white has tripled pawns. If the fact that black's king is still in the center is enough, well, the engine gives this a slightly better for white. This is, I turn on the engine just to see the exact evaluation. Plus 0.7 for white after knight c7 check. Still, I don't think this is as good for white. So that's what happens after c5. A very interesting way to simply break open the position straight away. And it might be strange that black is playing c6 and then c5, but he wanted to lure white into playing knight e5. The second move I would like to look at is b5, and here we are going to look at some critical lines, first played by Viktor Korchnoi, and this was a big thing, and it kind of still is. Okay, now after b5, if white manages to get his pawn back, then he's simply better, because this diagonal has been weakened because of the move b5, and black has simply overextended while neglecting his development. You might also be wondering, well, what's going on after knight takes c6. After knight takes c6, it seems like black is losing material, but he has this very interesting idea of playing queen to b6. And now white has nothing better but to play the critical move knight a5. I know this is complicated, but bear with me. If knight takes b8, then bishop to b7, and this knight is trapped. And of course, black is perfectly fine. The critical move is knight a5. Now, this may seem completely stupid because the queen can take the knight with check. But if the queen takes the knight with check, then bishop to d2 actually wins the rook. So, for example, b4 and bishop a8 wins material for white. Not that black is lost, but white is ahead. Definitely. So the main move after knight a5 is actually to play the move knight to d5. And this is the main critical move with which black is supposed to consolidate his material advantage. However, white continues with bishop to d2, now finally defending the knight. Knight c6, no better square to develop the knight to. And after knight takes c6, queen takes c6, you castle. Black plays bishop to b7, and now you continue with e4. So in the lines after queen b6, you don't get the pawn back straight away. You get it, well, in a second. So this position is 7 pawns each. So it's perfectly fine. And you have huge pressure. Why do you have huge pressure? Because black's king is still on e8. You're breaking through the center, and you have perfectly sensible development. Knight of 6, and now, again, the critical move, d5. Okay, if e takes d5, black is lost. That should be said immediately. If e takes d5, then e takes d5, queen d7, rook e1 check, and this is just busted. If bishop e7, then bishop b4 followed by d6. Loses, so he has to play king d8. Now bishop a5 check can be played, king c8, knight c3, and all of the pieces are flooding in. Black can resign. So against d5, black has to play queen to d7, defending straight away. And now white has a couple of options. Bishop to c3 is considered to be the best move, putting pressure on the knight. Bishop e7 defending, and now d6. And bishop d6 is what you basically have to play. You don't want to leave that pawn there or retreat the bishop back to f8 because e5 is coming. So bishop d6 and e5, seemingly attacking two pieces, but bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and b4 manages to get rid of all that pressure. So ef6, bc3, fg7, rook g8, and knight c3. And in this position, this is sort of similar to some gambits in the Italian game, except that white has a fianchetto structure. I would much rather be white. It's knight versus bishop. The g7 pawn is likely going to drop. In fact, black can take it straight away, but a nice position for white. So that's what happens after b5. And one thing you have to remember is this, after knight takes c6, this move queen b6 and then knight a5. That's the critical line. Okay, and now let's look at the most logical refutation of knight e5. That's the fact that white hasn't castled, so bishop b4 check comes with tempo. Now, your move is bishop to d2. There are two options here, queen takes pawn or bishop dropping back to e7. Bishop e7 is the main move. If queen takes pawn, then you trade pieces and get the bishop pair. So you play bishop takes bishop, queen takes e5, and knight a3. Okay, so in this position you are preparing to take on c4, so b5. And here is your compensation. So for the moment, again, black has 8 pawns, white has 6 pawns, white is 2 pawns down. So bishop d6, queen takes b2, 3 pawns down, which may seem ridiculous, but after castles and something like knight d5 to block the diagonal, you can see that black's king is stuck in the center. White can expand with e4. And after, for example, knight c3, white can continue with queen h5. And this is very unpleasant. If, for example, knight d7, then you continue with e5, cementing this bishop, making sure that the king never has any safety. h6 is one of the moves that black could play, and then e5, bishop to b7, rook to b1, chasing the queen away, but giving up the exchange. So knight takes b1, rook takes b1, queen takes a2, and rook takes b5. And this is just crushing for white. If c takes b5, which is basically forced, then bishop takes b7, picks the exchange back, and after b4, knight b5. This is not good for the black king. Black, of course, has, what does he have? He has 3 pawns and 2 exchanges, but white should be better. So if you want to play something crazy as black, play queen takes d4. You will have to be defending this position, but it's, I would say, highly unlikely you will succeed. A much more common move is bishop back to e7. And after this, we play normal chess. e3, developing, and now black can play c5. Again, he can play castles, and he can play knight bd7. If knight bd7 or castles, you simply pick up the pawn and you should be fine. If c5, you take, and after bishop takes c5, you can again just take this pawn. And after b5, which is the critical move, now again we come to the position where we take on c6. And this time there's no queen check, there's no queen b6. The bishop is on e7, so if queen b6, we can simply take here, and then the rook is hanging. So this line, black gives up the exchange. So knight takes c6, the queen was attacked. Bishop c6 check, you have to play bishop to d7, bishop a8, queen a8. Now this may seem lost for black because he is a clear exchange down, and of course the pawn situation is equal, but it's actually quite enough compensation. And from this position on, 6 games have been played, 2 games won by white, 4 draws, and if white castles, 2 games have been played. 1 draw, 1 win for black. So you actually have to be very precise. The precise move is f3. Not castling, but playing f3 to restrain the f6 knight. And now the same reply from black, even if you had castled instead of f3, e5. And now black has managed to turn the tables. Black is down material, not white, but black is the one attacking. You castle here, ed4, ed4, black castles here. And this pawn structure, when attacked by the 2 bishops, is extremely fragile. And this knight could come into h5, the queen is already perfectly placed, the bishop could come to c6. These pawns could start rolling down the board, the rook would come to d8, so definitely enough compensation for black. If I turn on the engine, it says +1 almost for white, but that's with extremely precise play. So to conclude things, the move c6 is very interesting, and I think that the line with bishop b4 check leading to the loss of the exchange is something you can play if you're a crazy player and aggressive, but you can also choose between b5 and c5 in this position, which are very different positions. So c6, I don't know, I usually play the Queen's Indian with black now, and against the Catalan I've been playing a6, the main line. But I'm actually thinking of switching to c6 because the positions are very interesting. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you got something from this video. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.